for tutorial 2. Yeah, we're gonna kick things off right away. So we're gonna start with the goals, or maybe I can quickly do the goals with the. There you go. So the goals of tutorial 2, we're going to provide a very brisk introduction to a very simple asocial reinforcement learning framework. This provides us with the basic individual learning mechanisms, right? And we're going to show you how to simulate data, how to do maximum likelihood estimation, the estimated models, the parameters of the model, and then to predict choices. And we're starting with asocial reinforcement learning because it provides a setting where we have individual learning from the environments. Then we're going to transition to social context. We'll provide social learning models that integrate social information by imitating behaviors that combine asocial and social learning, and also looking at things like some sort of a more hierarchy of different forms of social learning, including using theory of mind inference as well. I'm going to show you how this kind of very simple framework can scale up to more complex problems, integrating real-world visual or spatial contexts. And we're also going to provide some evolutionary simulations with examples as a way to kind of figure out what types of models are normatively the best in some social learning setting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to have Walter kick this off.
Yeah. So let's get started from the.
Really quick then, so.
Yeah.
Very good. Can you just check those?
Yeah. Oh, yeah, it works. Yeah. The simplest one, which is reinforcement learning without any social learning. So this is kind of conceptual diagram of reinforcement learning. So you can see the agent means like individual, animal individual. They can make a choice, which is action, like AT. A means like action at time t, so that's why there's t. So AT produce, interact with environment somehow. The environment could mean like the bandit game, multi-armed bandit, for example. So the action interact with environment, which would produce reward, which is R. And also in some cases, you can also think about your action would change the kind of environmental state. So in that case, so state S might also change, right? And then so this reward and state would feed back to the agent, and agent would, this agent knowledge might be updated, and then they would produce next action. But for the sake of simplicity, we're focusing on multi-armed bandit program, and as you played in a previous session, multi-armed bandit game, there's actually no state change. The state is based, so the task is basically the choice between multiple options, and actually the payoff structure isn't really changing in a basic setup. So you can actually here you can just ignore S part, so you can just think about environment produce reward R, and then reward feedback to the agent, and the agent choose next option again. So but that was maybe too abstract. So let me dive into more like step by step tutorial about like what's going on in reinforcement learning in multi-armed bandit setup. So yeah, let me show this guy again. So this is a newbie farmer. And he'd love to start farming, but he doesn't know which plant which crop to plant. So because he doesn't know anything yet, so his in his knowledge belief that the which potato and wheat is more profitable isn't really he doesn't have any idea. So therefore the preference is more or less the same. Let's say it's the same. So he doesn't have any strong preference between them. But yeah, just a coin flip thing. So he just happened to choose potato. And then what happens? Okay, so this is action, right? So this is his action, and this action produce like a result. So he plant potato, and then the potato would produce some like potato, right? And then, but let's say because the bad luck or some like potato isn't really much with this environment. The poor yield result, unfortunately. Right. So and then this result would feedback to his belief. Now he knows, oh well, okay, potato doesn't really work, didn't really work well in last season. So now he might have like a slightly preferring toward wheat. So then yeah, let's plant wheat then. And then as a result, oh, he enjoys this good yield. Oh, that's fantastic. So then this reward feedback to his knowledge and then his or belief. So now he believes strongly, preferring toward wheat. So then let's go wheat again, and so on and so on. So this is kind of, so as you can see, so this is kind of two unbounded, right? So two behavior options: planting potato, planting wheat, and then there are two steps in his behavior. So first thing is belief update, and also the second one is action. So the reason, or the benefit of using reinforcement learning model to study behavior in multi-unbounded is that we can actually we can estimate what's going on in unobservable process, like data generated process or cognitive process underneath of behavior or action. So which means only choice and payoffs are only observable thing, from the perspective of observer or experimenter. But we can explicitly assume that there's some process going on in unobservable world. So these are kind of belief update, and then this belief would generate this choice behavior. So this part is this is what we are also interested in, and so this is modeled through reinforcement learning, and we can study through model fitting or simulations, and yeah. Right, yeah, we can estimate through this choice and payoff data. Okay, so let me briefly walk through, explain one of the commonly used and one of the most simple version of reinforcement learning models. So for belief updating, so which is called Q-learning or Rescorla-Wagner type of model. Let's say this is like belief about value Q values, which is like behavioral value of each options, which is at time one they both are equal. Then he planted wheat, and he got a reward. So this reward experience feedback to this belief value, and then this process generate the updated belief in a next time trial. So how it is updated is so new reward and previous value weighted sum, and then this weighted average is next belief you got. And the important assumption here is that the unchosen option belief doesn't change, but this is also kind of an assumption you can make here. So which means you can also think about, like, for example, this unchosen option value might be also changing, right? So you can actually tweak such an assumption. So this is actually up to you, up to the modeler. But let me just here stick with the most simplest version. So let's say unchosen value isn't changing and only chosen value is updated. And so then he has this updated belief. Now he has a strong preference toward wheat. Yeah, more mathematically, like this can be so written as this, or oftentimes you can also you will observe this second formula as well in some papers and literature. Yeah, this is also commonly used form. And one nice thing is that you can and then there's a this is term as a term which is reward prediction error. So this is a difference between what you believed and what you actually got, right? So when this term is positive, which means you just got more than you expected. If it's negative, which means you got really less than you actually believed. So and some neuroscience study also they are interested in the correlation between this term and also some neural activities. So this is very interesting. So, but actually, mathematically, these both are the same, right? Okay, so then now we have Q value, and then this Q value need to be kind of mapped onto choice action generation behavior, which is kind of called policy. And what we want here is that the policy is kind of a choice probability. So this all over sum needs to be like 1. All over the sum of the possibility needs to be 1. And also we want these policies to be satisfied saying this relationship, like if you have larger Q value for behavior 1, option 1, then maybe the policy, the choice probability for option 1 is larger than that for option 2. So we want this policy satisfy this type of relationship. And then then this is like a commonly used formula to satisfy these regulations. This is called a softmax policy, softmax strategy. Yeah, so again, I'm showing 2 different things, but they are actually the same. So yes, the exponent E powered by the product of beta and Q value. So yeah, the Q value is right. The Q value is right. Belief. The beta here is another key free parameter, which is sometimes called inverse temperature. So let's say, for example, the beta is extremely large. Well, I'm gonna, I think, show, yeah. So yeah, then anyway, so this is, I'll explain it later. So then this probability will produce next choice. And then this is kind of probabilistic process. So which isn't really deterministic, but it's like a coin flip process and which produce next choice. So that's the assumption. And then the one nice thing is of using softmax function is that we can model a different type of choice decision-making behavior by controlling beta value. So for example, when beta is very large, which is shown by this yellow-green curve, so this means x-axis is a difference in these Q values. And then y-axis is choice probability, right? So, which means when beta value is large, this is really a steep S shape. So, which means if you have like at least slightly larger value for the Q value or wheat, then you're almost very highly likely to choose this wheat option in the next time trial. So, which means like your choice is really kind of preferring toward your preferable option. Whereas when beta is small, relatively small, so S shape is kind of very not really steep. So which means you still have some chance to choose non-preferable option, even though you have very strong preference for the Q. In terms of Q value, you might have very strong higher Q value than potato, but you have some still higher chance, some chance to choose potato actually. So which means your choice might be more explorative. So yeah, we can model this type of how exploitation is balanced is captured by this beta value. Okay, so that's that's it actually. So that's the kind of very basic, simplest framework of reinforcement learning, and to get some intuitive understanding of how this learning rate and beta value, inverse temperature can interact, and then how they are forming the behavior performance. These are interactive demo code in our tutorial code notebook. So please go to the code notebook and for tutorial 1 or tutorial 2, and please go to the these are the link to the
Yeah, I got it.
yeah.
It's already up. Oops. Okay, so it's tutorial 1, just below simulating data, and we have tweaking the visual learning parameters. It won't display anything until you press run. And it could be that, yes.
I just had a question. So like,
sure.
If you have 50% chance for the first time to choose like weeds for potato, and that the Q value is positive, so like your view is 0. Wow. Would you have any incentive to change this kind of model?
Yes. So as long as that Q value, right, is only relatively a little bit higher, you would still have some randomness, right? And even it also depends on your softmax temperature parameter, right? As we saw from that from that function, right? Unless it's very unless your temperature is very incredibly infinitely high, you're still going to have some variability, right? Even so, a small amount of difference along the y-axis here, x-axis here, you might still have less than 100% probability to test one, right? So we can model this both in terms of learning rate, how much we update as a function of the prediction error, and also based on the randomness in our policy, which is controlled by beta.
So like the beta parameters depends more like on the learning rate? Or...
No, alpha is learning rate. So remember here that we have this, right? So this is our reward prediction error. This is the unit of update, but it's multiplied by our learning rate, which is a coefficient. This is usually between 0 and 1. So when it's very small, we have very small incremental updates to our key values. It takes a long time and a lot of exposure to learn. When it's very large, we make very sudden and large updates. But sometimes those updates, if the data generating process is noisy, can actually cause us to overcorrect, right? And lead to small behaviors as well. So we have a combination of learning rates and this exploration policy, which has beta here. Okay. So hopefully you guys had a chance to kind of tweak some parameters. We are just talking about maybe a very low learning rates and very large. Actually, what was the opposite? I think you're in a situation where you kind of get stuck based on your first choice, right? That would be a kind of a high learning rate and high temperature. I think with a lot of people connected to the server, it might be a little slow, right? Okay. Hopefully some of you getting some results. Some people getting results? Okay, cool. So maybe I was just late to the party.
Is there the photos for the Shiny app?
It should be exposed, right?
Yeah, it should be,
Yeah, let's I think what there is though, at the very least, is in the notebook, all the code is also there, and then we just transform it in a Shiny app to then run different values of the parameters. Yeah.
Just because I don't know how to Shiny apps and I would like to do, but
yeah, let's get back to you on that one. We're talking in the coffee break, but I think it's been a while since we did this.
So yeah, those Shiny apps are just like a browser-based app, so you can play around later anytime. So yeah, by playing around this, you can observe what happens when alpha is extremely large or beta is extremely large or small, and then you can observe. What I actually forgot to include here is that we can also change the initial Q value as well. So we assume that the Q value update like this. But one needs to also have an assumption that from where Q value starts, and it doesn't necessarily be 0. So you can think about like Q value starts from very high value actually. So this is maybe mimicking some situation where you already have like really high expectation about sushi. I love sushi, so sushi must be good, and my Q value is really high. And then I move to Konstanz, and then to the random sushi shop. Then almost all options are kind of disappointing. For example, right? For example. So which means like although I don't have any particular like relative preference between these options, but if I have like really high initial Q value, and then afterwards like learning is always disappointing a bit. So this would also affect the future behavior as well. So you can think about what would happen if you have higher Q value at the beginning. Also, you can think about what happens if you have very low Q value at the beginning. And so this is like a interesting thought experiment. So anyway, so that's the kind of basic individual reinforcement learning. And then Charlie will be talking about how we can use this model framework to the behavioral data.
Cool, perfect. So we've been simulating some data, right? There's a question here. Yes. And I was trying to change like Excel alpha and minus data. I didn't see the difference. So there we're showing you performance. So it's maybe not only differentiable in terms of performance, but in terms of the pattern of choices, they are in principle differentiable. And we're going to show some more examples about how you can try to do estimation with simulated data. Okay, cool. So we're doing estimation now. Sorry, get caught up. And to do this, we need a likelihood function, right? So what is a likelihood? Well, let's think about a coin flip model, right? So I have this coin here. Imagine I flip it a few times. I record the observations, and it looks something like this, right? We can take the observed data, the amount of heads and tails that we've got, and we try to define in terms of some model where we assume, for instance, the data is sampled from some generative process. Here we can assume something like a binomial distribution, where the data parameter describes the probability of heads. In our case, we're describing using reinforcement learning as a generative process. A generative process is essentially something we can use to simulate data, right? So we just showed you how to simulate data. Let's start with something simple. This is coin flip model where it has one parameter, just theta. Whereas in our case, for the reinforcement learning, we have some other parameters like alpha and beta. Okay, so as a coin flip, let's imagine some different cases where the different data would lead to different kind of representations of probability of heads, right? And these essentially are the likelihood. So beyond only simulating data, we want to use models to describe the experimental data that we've observed. So to fit a model, we define a likelihood, the probability of the data given the parameters. And this describes the probability that the data was generated based on a model with parameters data. Okay? So if, for instance, our parameter theta is 0.8, we have a high probability that this describes the data of 8 heads and 2 tails. Now, we're not only modeling a single data point, but we're describing multiple data points, multiple sequences of choices often. And to do so, we need to describe the joint likelihood, which at first looks a bit scary, but we'll show you is actually very simple. The joint likelihood is likelihood that the parameters generate not only that one single data point, but all the data points in our sample, right? So all the i's. And this is described as this product over these probabilities, but products are kind of complicated. We prefer addition. And so we're going to just convert everything into log space using logarithms. What's very nice is that in logarithms, we can just replace multiplication with addition because that's the equivalent computation, right? So we're just summing up over all the observations in our data sets, the log probabilities. Now, since probabilities are always less than 1, the log of something that's less than 1 will always be negative. So this means we're having a sum of all these negative values. So it's often more convenient to express this using the negative log likelihood. Just add a negative sign here, because this would just give us a positive value. Now, when we add this negative here, what we're doing is we're expressing the amount of error in our predictions, right? This is also sometimes known as log loss. We want to minimize the loss. That's going to result in the equivalent to saying we're maximizing our likelihood of our predictions. So smaller values then describe better model fits. So you can think about this as kind of placing a bet, right? We're putting our money based on the parameters of our data that it's going to be this probability heads, this probability tails. That's our bet that we're doing with our model. The log likelihood of this just converts these outcomes to a log space, but with these negative values, it's a bit harder to interpret. So we're going to use the negative log likelihood instead, which is the log loss, right? So now what it means is that if we get a heads outcome, we have only this much loss. That's a good outcome for us. We don't accumulate much loss. But if you get a tails, we accumulate much more loss here. So that's bad, right? We're much happier when the model gives us a heads outcome. Okay, so sometimes you'll also see this term called deviance, which is just 2 times the negative log likelihood. This has some nice mathematical properties. I just wanted to get you familiar with this term, but largely we'll be operating in terms of log loss or negative log likelihood. Okay, so in the code notebooks, we gave you some simulation code for how to simulate data. Now, how do you get from model simulation to likelihood functions? Well, it's essentially the same thing. So here's an example in pseudocode of a likelihood function where the function, and this is using R, has 2 arguments, parameters, and the data. Okay, and what we do is we first initialize the negative likelihood to 0, and then we loop through the data. So each D is some choice in the data. And then what we're doing is we're making predictions at every choice with our model. And the model is defined by some parameters. So we make a prediction, we observe some action from the data. And then what we're doing is we're taking the prediction. So this is a vector over different outcomes, probability of heads, probability of tails, observed action, it's a heads. Then we take essentially the probability of that outcome, and then we convert it to log space and add a negative sign, and we subtract it from our negative log loss. So what we're doing is we're accumulating this log loss over trials, right? So we go through the whole data. Every time we make a prediction, we take the log of that of the actual observation under the prediction probabilities, and then we sum it together, and then we return this logs function. Okay, and what this means is that we can then show that certain parameters, values of parameters with less loss are better fits. Models of less loss are better fits. So this leads us to maximum likelihood estimation, which is the simplest way to fit parameters in model. We want to use this likelihood function we just showed you now to find the parameters where I added this little hat on theta, which represents the value of the parameters that gives us the highest likelihood for the data, right? We want to maximize the likelihood. So I was using this coin flip example. Let's imagine our data has 2 heads and 8 heads and 2 tails. And here we're trying to estimate the probability, the parameter theta, which describes the probability of heads. So we might have something like a likelihood function like this. I drew this by hand, so it's probably not exactly like that. But here we have the highest likelihood, right? The maximum likelihood at P of heads is 0.8, right? Because that's the most consistent for our data. Here I'm showing it in a likelihood space, but we can just flip that upside down. And now we're in negative log likelihood space, right? This is our log loss. We want to minimize the log loss. And to do this in practice, what we usually do is we take this likelihood function just shown you, and we wrap it inside optimization function, right? We wrap it inside an optimization function. It's going to iterate through different values of these parameters. It's going to jump around this parameter space and try to find some local optima, some local minimum in the space. There's a whole wide range of possible optimization functions. It's not always trivial to find a local optima that's actually anywhere close to the global optima. So notice here in this kind of example space, there's a bunch of places that are kind of local values, but they may not reflect what the true local value is, or the best set of parameters. So maximum likelihood estimation is somewhat noisy at times. There's a whole variety of algorithms you can use, such as gradient descent, simplex methods, which are simply just like kind of these geometric shapes rolling down the hill, and also differential evolution is also a very common approach as well. But there's just a whole host of these. in I think most of these code notebook examples, I just use something very simple, which is based on a simplex method. So let's use our RL example again, right? As an illustration. So here we're going over rounds. At each round, there's 3 options. The colors here represent the choice probabilities, the underlying choice probabilities for the model. We don't have access to this. We only have access to the discrete choices, these black dots that are actually chosen, right? But there is some generative process there, and we're trying to recover that. So we have these choices, these black dots. That's all that we can observe. And then this is what we give to the RL model. We also give the payoffs as well. That's important. And so what we're doing with our model is that we're trying to then fit the parameters of the model, for instance, alpha and beta, that maximize the likelihood of the observed data, right? And so here, given a set of parameters that we've estimated, we also recover some choice probability, right? And from our model, and it's actually quite similar to the choice probability of the generative model here as well. In the code notebook, we also give an example of what a loss landscape looks like for a Q-learning agent with one of these bandit tasks. So you can see that here we have different values of beta, and this different values of alpha. What the colors here correspond to is the negative log likelihood for a set of data that I've simulated. The simulated data are generated from where the square is. So this is where the parameters gave to the agent. I simulated a bunch of trials, and then I fit models with different values of alpha and beta to that data. And what you can see here is that some places are fit better, and some places are fit worse. But you also have a lot of places with very similar levels of fit, right? And so actually, when I computed the maximum likelihood estimate here, we get an estimate that's actually not that bad. It's actually quite close in terms of beta, but slightly overestimates alpha. Now here I simulated very few data points. So with more data, we can get more accurate estimates. But this also illustrates the fact that this is somewhat of a noisy procedure to do maximum likelihood estimation, right? That we're getting pretty good approximate results, but it's not exactly the true space, the true parameters that generate the data. Here I've shown you a model estimation within a single model where we're trying to figure out the parameters. How to kind of find the best set of parameters from the parameter space. But we also have to arbitrate between different types of models as well, right? So these models might have different kind of components. For instance, a softmax policy and a Q-learning rule. We might have different components instead, different types of policies, different types of learning rules, right? We might also have some different structure. Model may also have social learning components, which we'll talk about later, which has different components as well. And so what you have to consider is that each different model would have its own parameter space. And we will have to do, and we'll talk both today and tomorrow about how we can do model comparison and how we can do simulation across models as well. We have a quick 5-minute break, but I think I'm actually going to skip it if it's okay, because I want to do the model fitting exercise, right? So maybe what you'll do is we'll get right to the next part, and then that will be the interactive.
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to try to get to that by like 45.
Mm-hmm. Right. So thus far it was like we've been talking about social reinforcement learning without social learning. But yeah, let's talk about social learning. So yeah, again, this is the farmer, and he's playing around with potato and wheat problem. But what happened if he in this village he isn't alone? He lives with some other neighbors, right? And then also they are planting some and for crops. So in this case, this guy might be able to use social info. How? That's the issue, right? So so theoretically there are various different ways to include social learning in this type of model. But let me just show one of the example. Just one of the simplest examples, which is frequency dependent copying model. So which is simply saying probability of choosing option A is positively correlated with the frequency of other agent who are performing that same action. So F means like frequency. So basically like you're interested, you're counting how many other people are choosing that option. So like as you played in a social learning demo in the morning. So you can count how many people are there, and then you can react to the most popular option maybe. So that's the frequency dependent type of social learning. We could implement this type of social influence using in this reinforcement learning model. But before thinking about social learning strategy, let me briefly walk through what happened if in this population there are two different types of individuals. One is asocial reinforcement learners, and others are purely social learners who are always copying others. So what happens if there is this population is this type of heterogeneous individuals? So in this demo too, so you can go back to the code notebook and please open up the I'm always so
it's not this one, it's the one below.
The one below, yeah. So this one, so
imitation.
imitation. So in this demo, assumption is that basically it's so number of, so you can change the
It's not loaded yet, sorry.
yeah.
Or has it? No, it hasn't loaded yet.
Yeah, there are multiple individuals in the population, in the group. And then you can manipulate the
Maybe some extra slides.
all right.
There you go.
Yeah, and you can manipulate this number of agents in the population. And maybe interesting one is number of social learners in this population. So you can start from 0, which means it's just a pure reinforcement, asocial reinforcement learners population. So which is exactly the same as the previous one. Then as you can increase the number of social learners, like pure copiers in this population. Then what happens if you increase the social learners to maximum? Then in that case, everyone's just copying each other. So maybe you can observe the performance is totally just random, copying each other. No one actually study any bandit nature. So you can play around, and actually I think through this exercise you can eventually sense that there's how this Rogers paradox emerge. So this is actually a simulated result. So by changing this percentage of social learners in the population, actually the performance of social learners are initially very good. When there are few social learners performed very well. So which means you can enjoy reinforcement learners' effort, and you can just copy the popular option, and you can just enjoy the most profitable option, most likely. But as social learners density increases, gradually, there's a higher chance that you can just copy other social learners who don't really study much. So you're just copying other copiers. So this would gradually decrease the social learners' performance. So when it's kind of really extremely high, then social learning isn't really a good strategy anymore. So in that case, just learning without social learning, so reinforcement learning is the kind of better than social learning. So this is like a frequency dependent, negative frequency dependent type of game, which would lead the population to this point where social learning and individual learning expected performance would be the same. So in this point, so this is like so theoretically speaking, this is a evolutionarily stable point, and this is where this is why Rogers paradox is a paradoxical, because social learning doesn't really increase the population level payoff compared to pure asocial learners population's performance, right? So this is here. So social learning doesn't really necessarily increase the population performance. So okay, so this is yeah, so that's so that's the kind of neat one, is original paper by Rogers. Then so that's kind of just random copier and individual learners and the interaction. But we can think about more like we can think about strategically using social learning. And so let's combine the social learning process and reinforcement learning process together. So now we can think about this type of decision-making policy where basically this guy is, this choice policy probability is this combination of softmax of this guy and frequency dependency. So, and then these two terms, individual term and social terms, are kind of weighted averaged, and this gamma value is controlling this like weight toward social frequency information. So larger the gamma, this guy is more likely, his choice probability is more likely to be influenced by social info. But smaller the gamma, he's more or less asocial learner. So you can manipulate this guy's social weight. Yeah, and also when, let's say, he now decides to follow the social information, and then so it's these are a bunch of literature shows that humans and also many other non-human animals react to the frequency information in a non-linear way, which means when you observe, there are 3 people planting potato and 2 other people planting wheat, and then you are more likely to follow this majority option, and higher the probability higher than this proportion. So this proportionally more likely to copy this majority option. So this is called conformity bias social learning. So this kind of conformity level of strength could be controlled by another social parameter, which is theta here. So larger the theta, so your conformity bias is more strong, right? So, and the smaller the theta, you still maybe tend to be following this majority option, but this tendency isn't really strong when theta is small. So this is kind of combination of reinforcement learning and frequency-based copying. So then in the demo, third demo, in the code notebook, you can observe, you can manipulate this gamma value and theta value of these individuals and what happened in this population level.
Maybe I'll just not show it because I think we connect to it too slowly, right?
Yeah. Okay.
I think my big guys, I need to push out quite quickly.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. So maybe you can come back to the code notebook anytime later, and then you can play around.
Yeah, but you also feel free to play around with it. So here we've kind of shown you like the simplest form of social learning, where we have social observations if influencing us at the level of actions, right? But that's not the only form of social learning that's possible. We might also have observations influencing our value representations, right? Learning to value the perfect carbonara. Now I realize carbonara is actually, there's some, it's an ideal and perfect type of dish, as opposed to just something that's like one of many types of pasta, right? So now I have this kind of different valuation of carbonara that's going to influence my choices when I'm presented with different options. And later on Friday, Julian's going to talk a bit more about theory of mind, and that can also maybe change our beliefs or representations of the world, right? Our kind of like a model of the world can also change, right? So carbonara blew my mind. My whole model of how pasta works in terms of kind of what the boundaries are and etc. have maybe also changed, right? And that's going to shape how I plan my decisions in the future, how I make valuations and then select actions. So far we've shown you decision bias copying, which kind of influences our action at the level of policy, but we're also going to show you a very simple approach where social observations also change your value representations, which lead to different outcomes. So for instance, with our nice farmer, let's have a situation where maybe social influence is not at the level of our policy, but at the level of our Q values, right? We might have a very simple kind of social value update called value shaping, where our Q values are updated based on based on the frequency of people who choose that action times some kind of social bonus eta, right? So the more people that choose it, the higher we're going to inflate our value of it. Many people are choosing it, it must be quite good, right? And so this is a value bonus here. So with Code Notebook, with our demo number 4, we have some simulations here with heterogeneous groups of agents. Now you can select agents to be individual learners, decision biases, value shapers, and you can tweak all the parameters and try to see which strategy performs better than others. I think we'll get them actually. But because Robert for the you want to have a break. I really have a break there. Yeah. I said that rather have a break then than not have a break. We'll try to finish that for okay. Okay. Cool. As I kind of teased before, right? So far we've only looked at kind of very simple social learning models, but we can also use things like theory of minds to infer values or beliefs about the world from behavior, right? So these are representations we have about which things are how valuable, going to lead to rewards, or what the structure of the environment is like. Maybe this path will then lead towards better food options if I'm a forager, right? And we as humans definitely have this ability. It's debatable to what extent animals have this as well. Some animals can kind of already emulate what the desired goal is based on your behavior. And theory of minds, at least in humans, allows us to use social learning to unpack observed actions into these imputed mental states in terms of their desires, intentions, or beliefs or models of the world. In fact, this is exactly what we're doing here with reinforcement learning, right? We're taking people's choices and trying to unpack what their beliefs and values are that led them to make these actions. And so actually often what we use to model theory of mind is called inverse reinforcement learning. We're using something like a reinforcement learning framework to kind of model fitting in the same way. And that's actually used as a process level description often in terms of how humans do theory of mind. And Julian will talk much more about this on Friday, but here we're just showing you very simple social learning mechanism just based on the frequency of choices, but we can also get much more from that in human context. I also want to show you some kind of current work, I just uploaded the preprint recently, where we can scale up this kind of modeling framework to much more complex tasks. So here's an immersive collective foraging experiment I've implemented using the game Minecraft. So here people are foraging for hidden rewards in this field of watermelons, and the rewards are indicated by this blue splash. In this setting, we have different types of environments. Rewards are spatially structured. They're clustered together, right? You can see here from this bird's eye recreation. And so what this means is that even though everyone's foraging for the same number of limited rewards, the rewards don't replenish. When someone else gets a splash, you might also want to go over there and forage near them because that's going to suggest that there's other rewards nearby. And the reason we put all this painstaking effort to program this type of experiment in kind of this Minecraft environment instead of A/B type choices is that we have this realistic field of view and realistic spatial setting. The field of view creates these attentional trade-offs. We can it's costly to look for social information because that takes opportunity away from individual foraging, right? So when you're seeing social information, you better be close by enough to use it in a timely manner. Otherwise, if you see a splash really far away, you're never going to get a chance to exploit that. So we have these kind of really rich dynamic and social interactions through spatial position and visual gaze. And here's kind of what one round of the task looks like with these really nice spatial trajectories. And so the task, we have this really nice interactive tutorial where we're teaching people how to navigate this environment, how they're destroying blocks by clicking and holding the mouse for about 2.25 seconds. We're teaching them about that some blocks have rewards, some blocks don't. and that some blocks have spatial structure. We mapped the structure ones to watermelon, and other ones we mapped to pumpkins. They're counterbalanced between conditions, but it's kind of nice. And we manipulate also whether or not they're searching in solo groups. Everyone gets teleported to different fields that are identical, or if they're all searching the same field, they're all teleported to the same field, different locations. So with the solo setting allows us to kind of a asocial baseline where we can account for the structure and the environment, and to make sure that we don't estimate social correlations based on the fact that they're all searching the same environments. And we do this in a 16-round type of setting. And here we're able to develop a very simple computational model. This is the only equation in the main text of the paper, right? And it's just a very simple softmax. And so what we're doing is that we take this really rich dynamic task and we convert it to a discrete choice prediction task. When the participant has destroyed the kth block, we're trying to predict which k+1 block they're going to destroy. Very easy, right? We do this simply based on a softmax of features for each block that remains times some weights. So what these features are doing are they're capturing hypotheses about individual and social learning mechanisms, and I'll explain them on the next slide. And these weights, which we estimate using hierarchical Bayesian methods instead, Lei will talk more of this on Friday, capture kind of the influence of these different mechanisms, accounting for random differences across individuals and groups. Okay, so each block has some features, and we're trying to learn the weights to figure out the contributions to these features. Now these features, so here's a kind of illustration of the model. At some time point, we're focusing on this target agent here. We start with some very simple asocial features. So these asocial features capture things like which blocks are visible, right? Blocks are visible, more likely to be selected. Blocks close by are more likely to be selected. And here we've actually implemented a reinforcement learning model that uses also a generalization process. So this is more complicated than Q-learning. Q-learning assumes every single option is completely unique and independent. Here we use the thing that I've used in a bunch of my past papers to describe reward generalization, where we're trying to learn something like a function over the whole space. We're assuming some sort of spatial clustering, spatial structure, right? But here we essentially use this kind of under a logistic function where higher, more yellow colored blocks here correspond to higher probability of having a reward, right? So here what we're showing is that for that agent's asocial observations, they destroyed 3 blocks here of no reward, and they destroyed a bunch of blocks here with reward. That this is kind of the spatial structure representing their individual reward learning processes. So these are just the asocial features. But then we also have some social features as well. And the winning model here just has a very simple form of success-biased selectivity. We just differentiate between whether or not a player was successful or unsuccessful based on their own visibility data. So what we're able to do is that we've used this automated transcription of the visual field. So essentially at any point in time, we've recreated the entire game environment from their field of view. And we automate this in terms of we can detect which players were visible at any point in time and which events were also visible. For instance, a block being destroyed and someone seeing seeing the reward being present, the splash being present. And so what we do is that within kind of this t-1 to time t, sorry, I fucked up the notation. It should be k-1 to time k. We're trying to see which players are visible within that time frame. Right, we're not using information from players who are not visible, and then we distinguish players as being observed as being successful, or observed as not being observed as being successful. It's unsuccessful here. And what we do is then we categorize these agents into 2 different groups, and we compute a proximity measure. And there's multiple agents in that proximity measure. We use the centroid, right? So here we have success-biased proximity, and here's unsuccessful proximity. And we put these all together with the model weights, and to make our predictions, where this X here is the actual choice. And what we find is that people clearly differentiate between success-biased proximity, and this is much stronger, especially in these environments where it pays off. Right, so people are using their social information that they observe, and they're selectively targeting successful individuals for imitation. Another part of important aspect of simulating models is to also try to simulate evolutionary dynamics, right? So Watari talked about Rogers paradox, where Rogers paradox kind of has puzzling result that social learning, at least in this very simple form of implementation, doesn't yield any positive benefits to asocial learning. And you're only able to kind of figure out these dynamics through these evolutionary simulations. So social learning has what's known as frequency-dependent fitness. The fitness of any strategy I deploy in the world is going to be influenced by what other strategy other people are deploying. We're interacting in social environments. And so in this setting, it's quite difficult to figure out what is the normatively best strategy to choose, right? It depends on what everyone else is doing. And this has these kind of game theoretic dynamics, right? We're always playing these social games with one another. And so when we're learning in a social environment, we have to often resort to evolutionary simulations in order to determine what types of behaviors will emerge as normatively good solutions. And so in order to do this, one very simple framework is to program them as simulations. So what we do is you first initialize a population of agents. So for instance, here's a bunch of agents located in different kind of solutions in some fitness landscape. And then we simulate performance on the task with these agents in different groups. And then we select agents that perform the best to see the next generation. Okay, so this is kind of we have a selection process. And then we add a mutation process as well, where we mutate agents, for instance, changing them from one type to a different type of learner, or modifying the parameters. And then we repeat till convergence. So here's a very simple example. I had the code in the code notebook, where we're testing these kind of pure individual and pure social learners in this Rogers paradox setting. What we're seeing is that we're seeing a Rogers paradox in action. I start with only individual learners, and we see that they kind of get this very noisy convergence to some intermediate level. Often with evolutionary simulations, you need to run multiple repeats because each individual simulation is noisy, and then you typically aggregate over multiple repeats. Kind of show you a kind of real world example that's done by Alex. We briefly talked about the setting where each individual is searching their own reward landscape, but other people's landscapes are correlated with yours. So maybe you don't all like sushi the same way Wataru likes sushi, but you might also like Japanese food or other forms of food like ramen, for instance, and you might be able to use his recommendations, but with some grain of salt, where you still want to weigh your individual learning more strongly. And so in this setting, we tested these decision biasing agent we showed you about, and value shaping, which we talked about. But we also add this other form of model called social generalization, right? So we had this very simple kind of reinforcement learning loop here, where we select actions, we update our reward estimates, and that defines our value. Where crucially we have this reward generalization process using this Gaussian process model, GP here. This is what I briefly showed you in the Minecraft task, and it's not important or crucial that you understand what this is, but the other models here, decision biasing just uses social information to influence policy. Value shaping just gives a little bit of a boost to your value, but this social generalization model integrates into this reward generalization process. So when we observe, for instance, that here that has this reward value, we're also spreading this out across our own individual representations. Right, we're assuming that there's some sort of spatial structure in the environment, and we're taking social information into account for that. But we're assuming that social information is noisier than individual experiences because they're less relevant to us than our own personal experiences. So yeah, so here's what the underlying task looks like. And what we've done is ran these simulations where we started with different initial populations, right? We started with 100% value shapers, 100% decision biasers, 100% social generalization, or all these different kind of mixtures. And we ran these simulations so that they're all converging down here at this X here. So we've shown that no matter what the starting population is, if you allow for mutation between these three types of agents, and you allow for parameters to also mutate, we're going to reliably converge on social generalization being the best normative model. I'm going to kind of wrap up now with the summary open challenges. Yeah, so we've shown you that social learning can deploy a range of tools. You can directly copy observed behaviors through imitation, but you might also use something like value shaping to add a heuristic bonus to observed behaviors, right? To your value representations, so those behaviors. However, that certainly doesn't exclude the possibility that we also do more sophisticated forms of theory of mind to infer hidden value representations or hidden beliefs about the world and use that to inform our own behavior, right? Just like we can fit reinforcement learning models to choices, we can also do something similar to try to infer what other people's values are or what other people's beliefs are. And this only represents, however, still a very small subset of social learning mechanisms, right? But we try to focus on something very core, and that can be extendable to whatever your own individual research areas are. Intelligent behavior is not only a function of how each individual is trying to learn, right, and trying to use social information for its own individual benefit, but it's also how groups collectively solve problems, right? We have to do things like division of labor and specialization in order to more better complement one another, right? So it's not only trying to all maximize our own rewards in a greedy way, but if we can complement each other in some way, we might sometimes get something that's more than the sum of our parts. And in addition, I think a big part of that's kind of missing from this bandit setting is that we're only looking at very short timescales, right? But what Berto's talk earlier today was really addressing is these really large timescales, multi-generational innovation, where we're handing down solutions to future generations, and then we're innovating on them and additively finding better and better solutions, which produce these really massively complex cultural solutions, right? We all come from things like universities and other educational institutions that have been built upon hundreds of years, if not thousands of years of cultural innovation, right? And this is still something that needs to be built into these models in order to address. And so far, we've really focused on observational learning, right? We have social information as observations or choices, but social learning also very commonly involves pedagogy and communication, right? Like what I'm doing right now. You're not just following what choices I'm making, but I'm actively conveying kind of key principles and concepts to you through language, through pedagogy, right? And so this is also a very foundational aspect of human social learning. Yet for each of these mechanisms that we can describe verbally, that I'm doing right now, we can also define a computational model that captures them. And these computational models provide more precise commitments to the mechanisms of behavior that we're really trying to assume. And so this is the real advantage of modeling, right? We're taking vague verbal theories and we're defining them to concrete mechanisms that we can then test and compare. I think this is also why kind of in the modeling community, there's less kind of these ideological arguments and these kind of almost feudalistic infighting between different groups, because often we can just put these to empirical tests. And through experimentation and modeling, we can iteratively tweak and refine our understanding of social learning as well. So we can put these kind of concepts of cultural innovation, cultural transmission into practice, where we're hoping that by sharing the code and the kind of approaches that we have done in the past, you guys can also iterate on them, improve on them in a cumulative way, and we can find better understandings of human learning. We're done a little bit early, but it's great. We can have a few minutes for discussion, and then we can have a short break before Robert Hawkins' talk at 4:30. Okay, great. Do you want to hand out the microphones and for some discussion?
Yeah.
Yeah, great. Any questions?
I think the opportunity to ask any basic questions about like modeling in general, or why modeling is good. So
There's a question here.
Sorry, I have a
Yeah.
question, but when you do the maximum light figure estimation for the alpha and for the auto factors, what kind of data particular is the actions and the algorithm?
So what I do is I generate choices, and then I store the choices and the payoffs, right? Because we don't have access to the agent's underlying parameters in an experimental setting, but we don't have access to their Q values, right? Those are hidden in the brain. So essentially, oh yeah, actually you have a really good example of that, right? Yeah. Sorry, it's a couple of slides further. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so in this setting, right, people have these kind of underlying beliefs and choices, but all we have access to are their actual choices and their the payouts that they got for them, and then we're fitting the model based on that. Yeah.
Hey, thank you.
No problem.
I was just wondering if in a value shaping, so if it's belief, if the outcome shapes belief, and you have this belief to value direction, would the model look like?
Yeah, that's a very good point. I think so. When I talked about, I think Julian's figure, right? He makes this distinction. So, the higher level representations maybe something like our model of the world, right? For instance, like how you would get from here to the university, right? Now there's a construction, so my belief about the kind of the transition structure of the environment has changed, and so that's another type of representation you can have that might inform your choices, right? So for instance, if there's different, there's a beer garden in the university and there's a beer garden close by here, because of maybe I've learned from social information that it's much more difficult to get to the university, meaning I'm rather going to choose the other beer garden instead, right? And so this is maybe kind of a different level of representation that's part of how we do planning, right? We take these beliefs about the structure of the world, we kind of have some goals in mind, and then we use that to plan behavior, right? So that's kind of a very different setting to this kind of cached value representations. So we have these value representations. You might prefer a pizza or pasta. You might prefer sushi over salad. And these might just have some representation of this based on kind of in a very habitual sense. But for instance, in different contexts, right, when maybe some things are more fresh and more in season, you might also update those. And that's kind of more of a higher level representation.
How would you model like resource rationality? So like keep the model such that it will better fit human behavior based on the limitations of the resources.
Yeah, that's a very good point. So often what you might do is you can impose some direct costs on certain regimes of parameters. For instance, you might say that like your exploration is associated with more cost, right? Greater exploration based on your softmax temperature is associated with more costs. So you're going to try to put that under constraints. You might also build models that kind of have some limited capacity, right? Maybe some limited memory. So Q-learning doesn't really require memory. We just store a single value for each choice, but my generalization model does, right? You have to store past observations, then you kind of learn this generalization. So what you might have then is some prioritization to have some limited number of memories that you can keep, and you can't keep any more than that. So you can build in these limitations directly, although the reinforcement learning framework in this kind of in the baseline way doesn't assume any limitations. But increasingly, it's becoming more and more important to also account for these aspects of human behavior. One more question?
Do you think it's valuable to add some relative constraints to your model? For example, in your Minecraft experiment, you have some time for participants to consume the block. There are like certain flag within participants start when digging in the cube and then get to work. For example, adding this time to the model, I think that you have time. Serious modeling model. So do you think any those details can change the dynamics or change it?
Yeah, very, very much so, right? So we try to make it as simple as possible. Like people rarely do something different, do anything when they're between when they start foraging and end foraging, because if you stop clicking, that kind of cancels the action. They're also taught this in the tutorial. And so rather what we do is we kind of simplify it, right? So essentially, like from the moment you destroy block K, that at that moment we assume the world is fixed. We have found any features, then we have to predict which block we destroy next, right? So that's a simplification there, of course, but that allows us to kind of take a very impossibly complex setting and then turn it into a simple, a discrete prediction task that we can actually model attractively. Okay, so maybe one more question, then we'll have a 15-minute break. Yeah. One more question here.
I'm curious about the paper you discussed where like you learn from people with different mark functions or evaluations. Like, do you have anything more to say about like how people learn what people find rewarding, or people use other heuristics, just like you did axiom or like you did.
Well, Alex, who handed you the microphone, was the first author, so maybe she can address that question more directly.
That is one of the group projects. similarity between like players as in like this guys were similar, so that's why I'm imitated more than the others.
You know, how do people figure out like learning that other people who were out of country where it can be like infer if they accidentally
That is an interesting question, but that's something we don't want to paper. We start them on like, hey, so the cover starting through the abstract, like you're an astronaut, you're going on planets to collect salt. So like everyone's collecting different salt, but the salt is produced by specific structures on the bullshit. That's where the facial formations are some of the salts. So you don't know anything about differences between people. We can't exclude the assumption that maybe some people like early on saw this guy had a lot more similar spots on his script compared to me, so in the Republican War. So we have a post experiment question where we're like, hey, did you trust anyone more than the others? And it looks like people are pretty don't seem to be biased, at least as far as they are classified. And I'm hoping that's accurate. I was considering doing a twist where there's like different correlations between different people, but that would be very much follow up and not.
Exactly. I think we wanted to focus on a simpler case here of how can people use social information, even though it's not exactly applicable to you, but then individual differences adds a lot more complications. So we kind of wanted to kind of bracket that out for the study, although that's certainly something that's very important.